Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the National Press Theatre. Bienvenue au Théâtre National de la Presse. Joining me today, Council of Canadians and the lawyer for the applicants in the federal court case. I'm Laura Payton. I'm going to be chairing today. Please turn off your cellular phones. S'il vous plaît, fermez vos appareils portables. To my right is Garry Neil, Executive Director of the Council of Canadians. Then Frank Graves, President of Ekos Research, and Stephen Shrybman, lawyer for the applicants. Go ahead.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Garry Neil et je suis directeur général du Conseil des Canadiens, qui est le plus important organisme de la société civile et compte 75 000 membres d'une rive à l'autre à l'autre. À mes côtés aujourd'hui, il y a Frank Graves, président de Ekos Research Associates, et Stephen Shrybman, du cabinet d'avocats Sack Goldblatt Mitchell. Stephen est le conseiller légal des 9 plaignants qui ont déposé des requêtes pour contester les résultats des élections fédérales dans 7 circonscriptions. Je regrette qu'aucun des intervenants de ce panel ne parle assez bien français pour faire des commentaires ou pour répondre aux questions en français. Cependant, du fait que les questions légales sont extrêmement sensibles et nuancées, et aussi parce que les données de la recherche effectuée sont extrêmement techniques, nous allons devoir faire ces présentations en anglais. Une interpretation simultanée vous sera fournie. Late yesterday, the Council submitted the final piece of evidence in the matter of the legal actions launched by 9 electors under the Canada Elections Act to overturn results of the May 2011 federal election in the ridings of Don Valley East, Elmwood-Transcona, Nipissing-Temiskaming, Saskatoon-Rosetown-Biggar, Vancouver Island North, Winnipeg South Centre, and Yukon. Today, we are releasing the results of research undertaken by Ekos Research Associates. Frank.
Good morning. We were commissioned to look into basically 3 questions. First of all, was there evidence of misleading calls in the 7 ridings that we were asked to look at? If that was the case, is there evidence that that was targeted to certain types of groups in a fashion which would be improbable otherwise? And finally, did it make any difference? Did the world look any different if this stuff happened than it would have if it hadn't? The challenge of looking at that question nearly a year later is significant. We did a number of methodological innovations to try and ensure that we could come up with an accurate answer, and we feel pretty comfortable that we have sound answers to the first 2 questions and some strongly suggestive answers to the last question. One of the problems that we have is as we move away in time, it's now nearly a year from this event, memories become a little more sketchy, and we also know that this issue has been in the public profile, so there's a chance that some of the issues could be reactive. In other words, respondents could know about the question we're looking at, and in some ways their responses could be different than they would have been if they hadn't heard about it. In order to deal with this, we decided to create a comparison group, and the comparison was created by creating a random sample of all of the ridings where there had been no reported activity. Interestingly enough, it does appear that there is activity going on in most of the country. In fact, one of the features of the last election seems to be that there was a ubiquitous presence of these sorts of activities. But we did find that when we compared the comparison group with the 7 subject ridings, there were some pretty distinct differences. First of all, the overall incidence of individuals who'd received calls, and by the way, there's all kinds of legitimate calls, as you know, where individuals are called and asked to identify which party they're going to support and to enlist their support for funding and to show up at the vote and so forth. In our study, we found about 40% of those in the comparison ridings received those calls, a little more than that, and about 60%. So there was a more level in the treatment groups or in the subject groups. So there was a more intense level of activity. That in itself is not particularly revealing. What is revealing, I think, was the improbable connection between those individuals who, during the first stage of voter identification, provided the fact that they were not voting for the Conservative Party, that seems to be linked by a factor of 2 to 1 to an increased probability of receiving a second late call. Now, the second late calls, which were received by approximately 17% of all voters, at least recalled in the subject ridings, which is a couple of points higher than in the other ridings, were in fact a blend of both legitimate and, it seems, according to the survey, illegitimate calls. Legitimate calls are where the party identifies themselves and says, can we count on your vote? Can we tell you where the station is? We maybe perhaps should like assistance. All of that kind of legitimate get out the vote materials. There are other kinds of calls, however, which would not be legitimate. The individuals that are calling are required to identify themselves as representing a political party. They have to identify who they are accurately, and they have to provide accurate information. It appears that there was a significant incidence of calls which, according to the respondents, did not fall into that category. For example, in the subject ridings that we looked at, there was almost no actual movement of polling stations. In fact, only one in one riding, which is a fairly picayune fraction of the overall stations, actually was changed. Somewhat surprisingly, then, we find that a significant number of the respondents who received late calls said they were told that their voting station was changed. So we would classify that as an illegitimate call. Similarly, although less clearly, callers that did not recall the political party identifying themselves and were told that they were being called, or at least thought they were being called by Elections Canada, constituted another significant fraction of calls in these ridings. In this case, the reality is that Elections Canada called nobody, but there was a sizable number of individuals in each of these ridings who felt that they had been called by Elections Canada. Finally, we asked people whether or not the information they'd received in the late calling was indeed accurate, or whether they had received misinformation. And there was a significant portion who said, no, actually the information that I received from that call was inaccurate. Now, what's also really notable is that the pattern with which those calls were received, the misleading calls, was dramatically skewed to those people who are not supporters of the Conservative government. The incidents would range from, in the case of questions where you were told that your polling station had changed, to differences of 3 to 4 times the likelihood of receiving that call if you were, for example, a Liberal, an NDP, or a Green Party supporter than if you were a Conservative supporter. Similarly, although less dramatically in the case of the elections, the calls that seemed to be identified by Elections Canada, there was about a 50% greater likelihood of saying that you received that call if you were not a Conservative supporter. In the cases of the misleading information, those who characterized the calls that they had received as erroneous, the differences were once again in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 times differences between Conservative voters who received very few of these calls and other types of voters who received quite a few. And just to make the final point before taking a question, or I can take a question right now if you'd like, we tried to assess what impact this had by removing the cases from the sample who had experienced these kinds of events. We also asked people to tell us whether it influenced their voting behavior. And in each case, we came up with similar estimates of the impacts, which would range from about, on average, about 1.5% of non-Conservative voters who did not vote, apparently, as a consequence of this.
Thank you. Stephen will just briefly update where we are with the legal cases.
Very briefly. We have now served all of the evidence that we're going to adduce in support of the 7 applications that have been brought before the federal court. The respondents, who include all of the candidates and the chief electoral officer, have now 30 days to introduce their affidavit evidence that they'll be relying on in support of their participation in the proceeding. We know that only the Conservative candidates in the ridings will be opposing our application. The cases will be managed, the court has advised. We will certainly be making the argument that they be dealt with as quickly as possible. This is the classic case of justice delayed will be justice denied in light of the fact that almost a year has now passed since the election. Thanks, Garry.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me just make a few final comments before we open it up. I want now to summarize briefly what we submitted last week, since it's important to understanding the full picture. First, we submitted an affidavit from Annette Desgagnés, a former Responsive Marketing Group, RMG, employee in Thunder Bay, Ontario. During the election, she made calls on behalf of Conservative Party candidates in many ridings, and she identified herself as calling on behalf of the Conservative Party. 3 days before the election, however, she and her colleagues were given a new script that stated calls were being made on behalf of something called the, quote, Voter Outreach Centre, and their purpose was to advise voters that Elections Canada had changed the location of their polling station. She overheard one of her colleagues adjust the script to read that he was calling on behalf of Elections Canada. She called voters in many different ridings, including specifically Nipissing to Miskaming. Elections Canada has confirmed in a letter that only one polling station in one riding of the 7 involved in our cases was changed, and that was in Vancouver Island North, and the process used to notify electors did not include telephone calls. We also submitted an affidavit from Bob Penner, President and CEO of Strategic Communications Incorporated. In a 20-plus year career as a political consultant, Penner has developed and implemented sophisticated voter contact programs. Stratcom was one of the first Canadian firms to specialize in this area. Penner's expert evidence is that if a call advising electors that Elections Canada has made a last-minute change to polling station locations is made to the supporter of another political party, it was for the purpose of suppressing the vote. Quote, the only plausible explanation for such calling to have occurred is for someone at the senior level in a central political campaign to have authorized the strategy and provided the data and the funds with which to carry it out. In total, we have submitted 12 affidavits from individuals in the 7 ridings who were victims of the fraudulent calls. Now we have the report on the voter research conducted by Ekos. Les résultats de la recherche Ekos sont concluants et choquants. Les appels frauduleux ont été largement répandus. Des dizaines de milliers d'appels de ce genre ont été passés. On a ciblé les individus qui ne soutiennent pas le Parti conservateur, et cela a eu l'effet attendu. À cause de ces appels, la capacité à voter des sympathisants de NPD, des libéraux et des Verts a été sérieusement affectée. The results of the Ekos research are conclusive and shocking. The fraudulent calling was widespread. Tens of thousands of deceptive calls were made. It was targeted at individuals who were not supporting the Conservative Party, and it had the desired effect. Supporters of the NDP, Liberals, and Greens who received these calls were less likely to vote. While it is very difficult to quantify the absolute effect, Ekos estimates that between 0.8 to 2.2% of the total eligible voters in the 7 ridings were successfully dissuaded from voting as a direct result of these calls. Since we first launched our campaign, the Conservative Party messages have been these. The Conservative Party did not make calls misdirecting voters. There was one rogue campaigner who was responsible for such calls in the riding of Guelph, Ontario. Some calls may have been made inadvertently, and the Conservative Party wants to get to the bottom of this. The Council of Canadians is a nonpartisan organization. Our supporters include members and supporters of all of Canada's political parties. But the evidence is powerful and leading inexorably in only one direction. We know that the voter suppression campaign was extensive. It was targeted at supporters of the New Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, and the Greens, and it had to have been approved by a senior campaign official with access to a central database and authority to spend money. The response of the Conservatives to this latest evidence is entirely predictable, because anyone who dares to raise questions about their political agenda or to challenge their actions is attacked. We fully expect that they will lash out at everybody involved in this process. They will call us names and accuse us of having nefarious motives. By attacking our character, they hope to marginalize us and to diminish our evidence. But this is about the rights of individual Canadians to cast their ballots freely. It is about exposing dirty tricks perpetrated in last May's federal election. It is about defending democratic rights and principles that all Canadians believe in. We are determined, and we will follow this through to the end. We believe we have built a very strong court case to overturn the election results in the 7 ridings and to restore to those Canadians their most fundamental democratic right. Thank you.
Okay, moving to questions. Julie Van Dusen, CBC.
Maybe you could all take this, but I'm just wondering, are you suggesting that the MPs who hold these seats in these contested ridings, where they won so narrowly, are you saying that they hold them illegitimately?
The results are illegitimate, yes. We believe in all 7 ridings that there is sufficient quantum of data to indicate that the elections were stolen in those ridings.
Yeah, my analysis is more sterile, and I wasn't asked to make those types of conclusions, and I don't really make any moral judgments on this. Others can and should do that, and the court will, and Canadians will. But what I can say clearly is that there was a significant amount of this inappropriate activity occurring in these ridings, that it was dramatically and improbably targeted at non-conservative voters, and that it really made a material difference on the outcome of the ridings. So, and I would have found the exact same conclusions if I'd been asked to do this for the Conservative Party of Canada or any other agent. The results are, and I believe, within the margins of error and the measurement problems that exist, are robust. They're sound, and I think that there's more that can be done and should be done, but these conclusions are pretty solid.
A quick follow-up for you then. Did you think twice about coming out today because you've had your run-ins with the Conservative Party?
Not really. I mean, if I was worried about that, I'd stay home all the time. And it's too nice a day, even with the rain, to do that. So no, I didn't worry about that.
Hélène Buzeri, Le Devoir.
Yes, maybe my question for you, Mr. Graves. Since the very beginning of this controversy, all indication is that maybe the Conservatives are behind this. At least that's the suspicion around. So I'm wondering, when you call people and you ask what were their voting intentions, is it not possible that if you are a Conservative, because you know that there is this suspicion around, that people will not tell you if they receive those calls, and therefore it becomes a survey of self-fulfilling prophecy, that you get the results that, in fact, you were hoping to get, in a sense, because...
Yeah. By the way, my analysis doesn't say anything about who the agents who may have perpetrated this. It just says there was stuff going on. There's sort of 2 pieces of evidence that would suggest that the idea that this might have been just mere reflection of the disgruntled opposition voters trying to ventilate and get back for being sore losers. The first is that, first of all, as an expert in public opinion, and this, by the way, there was no public opinion, this was all behavioral. There was nothing said, is this good or bad? It was simply, did this happen or not? The likelihood of the kind of exaggeration due to those sorts of effects that is compared to the magnitude of the effects, it just simply never happens. You do not see that level of pollmanship occur. You may have, I don't doubt there are some people in the sample who said things because they had an axe to grind one way or the other. But those effects would never explain the magnitude of the effects we're seeing here today. But there's an even more powerful reason not to believe that that's the case. In the comparison group, which was defined as places which had relatively less activity, we did not find the distinct patterns of profiling that we found in the subject areas. So in order to believe that this was simply a product of the disgruntled response of non-conservative voters, you'd have to then make a case why these 7 disparate ridings, which are not connected by geography or any other factor, show this completely improbable difference in terms of the likelihood of saying that they'd received the calls from if they were supporters of non-conservative party choices. How on earth would there be that level of sophistication or literacy that people in these ridings would be able to say by a margin of 3 and 4 times, it's not 10% or 20%, it's 300 or 400%, that they had received these calls where we saw none of those patterns? If it's simply an artifact of disgruntled voters ventilating, expressing concerns, then you would have seen it that pattern throughout, and you wouldn't have seen these vivid differences across the comparison group and the subject groups.
But I was asking the question the other way around, though.
Okay.
Is it possible that in those writings, that maybe they were indeed those calls, but they were directed to everybody, because it was a Pierre Poutine doing it for fun, let's say, and that Conservatives voters would not tell you, yes, I did receive that call, because they're afraid that their party will be accused of being responsible for those calls.
I think that really overstates the public fluency on the issue. It simply wouldn't be that high. And yes, I think there is some evidence that there were ubiquitous types of this stuff going on throughout the country. The levels, even discounting for people over-remembering or manufacturing, are simply too high. And we do see some patterns in the other parts of the country. Certainly some questions, like we also looked, and I didn't speak today, about the question of harassing calls, which were calls which 9% of the participants in the subject writings, but fully 7% in all the other places said they'd received suspicious calls that they thought were designed to provide misinformation or to intimidate or those kinds of things. In that case, there was a pattern. It wasn't that clear, but it was not unique to the 7 ridings. It was one which we saw throughout the rest of the country. We also found Conservative voters in many of the other places who said they'd received these calls and they'd discouraged them to vote. So there were Conservatives who said they were discouraged to vote because of receiving certain types of calls, just not the calls about false voting stations. And that was where we saw this pattern.
I should just add that for purposes of our legal cases, we do not think it's necessary for us to prove who was behind the calls. The Act is pretty clear that if there were irregularities, fraud, or corrupt or illegal practices sufficient to overturn the results, sufficient to have affected the outcome, that the judge would be empowered to overturn the results. And we don't believe there's any requirement for us to prove exactly who was behind them. We merely have to prove they happened, they were fraudulent, and they affected the outcome.
Terry Malewski, CBC.
Even so, you have drawn conclusions about who's responsible, whether or not it's key to your case. Frank has already said he didn't draw those conclusions about who's to blame, but you do. And you say it leads inevitably to one conclusion, someone in a senior position in the Conservative Party, etc. The Conservative Party has said from the outset, has it not, that as many as 10 or 15 people in every riding would have access to SIMs. So many people could easily have had that access without telling or the central command of the party or them finding out. Ideas spread easily. Perhaps lots of rogues in lots of ridings did the same thing. How can you draw the conclusion that you do, that the high command was responsible for this?
Because it was so sophisticated, it was so orchestrated, it was so managed. Annette Desgagnés said 3 days before the election, she was told to reboot her computer. There was a new script. She wasn't just calling people in one riding. She was calling people in a variety of ridings across the country. It had to have been managed centrally.
It's the fact that they had used data from multiple ridings. That's your point, right?
Let me just, if I can clarify, I mean, I'm retained by the applicants in these proceedings, and ultimately the decision will be made by the court. The council has its views, and I'm sure everyone who's followed this will as well. But ultimately, it'll be up to the judge to determine whether under the Act there were fraudulent or illegal activities that took place in these ridings that affected the outcome of the election. We introduced Mr. Penner's evidence to discount the notion that this was inadvertent or a mistake, because we have to establish that indeed these calls were intended for the purpose of misleading people so that they would not exercise their democratic franchise. That we believe is necessary in order to make out the case that these were fraudulent and illegal calls. So that's what Mr. Penner's evidence is ultimately about. Could this have been an accident? Could this have simply been a simple and honest error? And in his view, it was not.
If I could just follow up one more step. The suggestion is made that it's so sophisticated and so managed, I quote. If so, why did Conservatives get the calls? Some did, right?
In the subject ridings, yes, because, for example, and I'm not making any claims about who authored this, but I can speak to the question of why, whoever it was authored, the targeting was not perfect. Targeting was very good. I'm surprised, fourfold differences based on the kind of information that's available. That's really quite good. One of the interesting indicators is when we asked people who had received the calls whether it made a difference and, in fact, discouraged them to vote. Only 0.1% of Conservative voters in all of those ridings, in other words, an almost immeasurable group, said that, in fact, it had that effect. The numbers were 15, 20 times higher for other groups. But in terms of the question of why that could happen, the voter identification process occurs at a household level. So it's quite possible that you get the one spouse on the line the first time, the subsequent call is to another spouse. There's not 100% congruence in the voting patterns within the household. It could easily explain what are pretty modest levels of parent mistargeting. So, another provocative connection was the incidence of those who had provided in the first round of legitimate voter identification activities their voting preference, who had said it was non-conservative. This was, in fact, linked to a 2-to-1 probability of receiving a subsequent illegitimate call. That's not firm causal evidence, and it doesn't sort of clearly point to who the author is, but it is a provocative linkage, which suggests that the voter identification process was linked to the subsequent process.
I've got 3 more people on my list for questions, so let's try and keep the questions and answers brief. Martin Stringer, CPAC.
One of the Conservatives' arguments has been that there were poll changes, and you chose 106 ridings as your control group, if I understand correctly. Did you try and correlate those ridings with ridings that did have poll changes, real poll changes, or ridings that didn't have poll changes? Because the argument could be made that high number of calls late in the election to say your poll has changed were, in fact, in ridings where polls had changed.
We've asked Elections Canada for a comprehensive list and we haven't yet received that list. They did assure us, or they did confirm, that in the 7 ridings that we're concerned with, only 1 polling change occurred. But we don't know where the rest did, other than in a very broad way, and that you can find in Mr. Miran's evidence before the Parliamentary Committee on March 29th, I think it was.
I think that's something that has to be examined more closely. There are some issues that are crying out for further research and attention. But I don't believe that, for example, the instance of polling, I've seen some data on the instance of polling station changes, and it was not widespread. The fact that there was almost no polling stations changes, in fact, 1 out of all the polling stations, which is obviously almost as a Picayune fraction, and that you had an elevated reporting rate of polling station changes in this compared to the comparison riding is probably the more telling statistic. But I think it would be useful to look into that other question.
The question is, Garry Neil, you said that from Mr. Graves' results, the conclusion that there would be that, because this is all about vote suppression, and Mr. Shrybman, you said that what you have to prove is vote suppression. That's what's going to make the day in the court. The conclusion is 0.8 to 2%. Can you tell us how you arrived at that conclusion of the effect of vote suppression?
Probably Frank is better to say where that figure comes from.
Yeah, I can. And by the way, I'll be candid. Drawing causal attributions from any sort of data is extremely difficult in the absence of experimental design. And so we are circumspect in saying exactly what the magnitude of the effect would be. But I do have a background in evaluation research and research design, and I do think that within the levels of evidence we had 2 distinct tests that we used for this. One was to use self-reports of the respondent who said, if you've experienced these things, what impact did that have on your voting behavior? Now, obviously that test can be conflated with self-interests and other kinds of factors, but nonetheless, that produced an estimate of about 1.4%. Interestingly enough, that's the place where the 0.1% were composed of Conservatives. There was no effect in the subject ridings. But we used another test which I think is more powerful. And the idea of causal analysis is to say, if I remove the effects and looked at what the world would have looked like if this had never happened, the so-called counterfactual hypothesis, that would give me an estimate of the causal impacts. And I do have a way of